It is just so wonderful to see you here today. And I thought, I'm going to be doing that soon. So yes, thank you very much. We just weren't sure how comfortable people would be coming or not coming. So this is just absolutely fabulous. I'm still going to say it, but I know most everybody knows. I'm Helen Rinsberg, president of the Cincinnati Asian Art Society, CAAS to our friends. And like I said, it's so great to see everybody in person. And it's just been way too long, but we have a full schedule starting in January through May. And we're already booked and everything January through April. And it's just May we're waiting on because it's our Art of Asian Cooking. And we're just waiting to see how the restaurant is doing when we get closer to that. So thanks to Home Sung, we have been introduced, no, I'm sorry, I knew Peter. But we were introduced to the fact that Peter's been doing some pretty cool stuff lately. And we're always pleased to do something on Korea because it tends to be overlooked a lot of times in the Asian world. And it's a darn shame that it's overlooked. So he is going to talk about Mistaken, Forgotten, Revived, A Painting's Journey. And Peter is the Kettering Curator of Asian Art at the Dayton Art Institute. So he will explore the life of a monumental Korean screen painting. We hope to do this in person with you, but it just didn't work out with getting it out because it's not on display right now. So part of the museum collection since 1941, it was progressively marginalized, only to recently receive new life through fresh research and extensive conservation, and that will be part of Peter's talk, letting us know the detectives that were involved. In addition, he will provide an overview of the DAI's recently reinstalled Korean art collection, so we kind of have a bonus there. Peter specializes in religious aesthetics with a particular focus on Japanese and Euro-American traditions. Undergirding his work that brings together the fields of religion, philosophy, and art is a concern with what it means to be human and how humans can flourish. Within a museum context, he investigates how objects give us insight into these broader questions. During his time at the DAI, Peter has curated exhibitions within the Asian collection and across the museum's collection as a whole, including one of my favorites, Samurai Ghost and Lovers, the Yoshitoshi Collection, Complete 100 Aspects of the Moon. In company of friends, the Kettering and Patterson Legacy, Buddhist Art, An Enlightened Thread Through Asia, and Devoted, Visual Performances of Faith. Peter holds a PhD in Art and Religion from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and has published articles, encyclopedias, entries, and reviews that span aesthetics, film, art, and religion. So now I'm going to shut up and turn it over to Peter.
Thank you, Helen, for that great introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Well, it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to present to the Society. I can see there's many enthusiastic members, and also thank you to the Taft. It's wonderful to be here and that they've provided a venue where, after 20 months, we can all be together again and in person, enjoy talking about art. So today, when you go to the museum and you walk around and you see an artwork in a case behind glass, and then you may think, well, it's a relatively static object, it's just kind of there. I go, my life changes, but when I come back, the object's always the same. But as we know, objects, just like humans, they have lives of their own. They have adventures of their own. They have interesting backstories. And like us, they're material creatures. They degrade. They change physically over time. So I want to tell you about one artwork today in the Dayton collection, and in particular, tell you a little about its backstory, which includes mistaken identity, as well as radical transformation. So first, I want to take you to 2020, relatively recently. Here we have commemorative medals that were made by Comsco, which is the Korean mint. And these medals celebrate the Dayton painting. They made bills, gold bills, silver bills, as well as gold bar commemorative medals. Also, last December, the painting was featured in a special solo exhibition at the National Palace Museum in Seoul. Here you can see the painting being installed. And they even had a virtual exhibition you can still see online to kind of walk around the gallery if you couldn't make it in person. So this painting was celebrated, including having a symposium, which due to the pandemic had to be online, posted as videos through YouTube. And it was admired for being an outstanding masterpiece of Korean painting. It is one of the largest screen paintings from the Chosun dynasty, and it's one of only 2 known paintings in Korea that uses gold leaf in the background. So it's recognized as a singular example of Korean art. However, would you be surprised if I told you 15 years ago, this painting was wrapped up in storage in Dayton, Ohio, identified as a Chinese painting. It was in fragile, delicate condition, and most likely would never have been exhibited again. So, what happened? How did it undergo this re-identification? How did it undergo its physical transformation? That's a little about what I want to talk to you today. So, to understand it better, we need to go back in time to 1940. The early years of World War II, to Berlin. That is where Mary Marvin Brackenridge was stationed. A graduate of Vassar College, she was prolific in many fields, including as a cinematographer making early silent film documentaries. She was a photojournalist, and during the war she worked for CBS as one of Murals boys, as one of the correspondents in Europe, relaying stories to the people back in America. Also in Berlin was Jefferson Patterson, the son of NCR co-founder Frank Patterson, as well as Julia Shaw Patterson Carnell, the matriarch of the Dayton Art Institute. Patterson was from Dayton. He was stationed in Berlin as the first secretary of the United States Embassy in Berlin. The 2 of them met and fell in love, and subsequently were married in 1940 and enjoyed a belated honeymoon in Santa Barbara in 1941. It was in 1941 then that Jefferson Patterson was reassigned to the embassy in Lima, Peru. And it was during this time that the museum received correspondence from Mary Brackenridge in the form of a Western Union telegram, as well as subsequently a letter sent from on board her ship en route to Lima. And I apologize, can everybody see okay? For people in the cheap seats in the back, the screen's a little small. But you can see that she telegrams the DAI saying she's leaving shortly. She's at the St. Regis Hotel in New York. And she says she would like to offer an 18th century Japanese screen painting. It's made on 6 panels, and it measures 24 feet wide by 8 feet high. So for reference, I'm 6 feet tall, so add 2 feet above that, or do 4 of me vertical across the ground, and you can get a sense of how big this thing is. So she says, the Lawrence Roberts at the Brooklyn Museum thinks this would be a great addition. Stop. Let me know if you're interested. Stop, etc. You know how telegrams from this period go. So the Dayton Art Institute was interested. They let her know that. And it's important to note she mentions this was a 6-panel screen, not a folding screen. So you can see the way it was separated here on 6 flat panels. And it's a little hard to see, but Here you can see then there were just basically dowels and holes that were used to just put this thing together to make one large flat piece that you could stick up on the wall. And keep this in mind, the fact that it's these 6 panels. This will be somewhat important later on. Especially note how the panels on either side are a little bit shorter than the ones in the middle. So something's going on there. Then Brackenridge wrote further en route from the boat that she was on, and she provides a little bit of background on this painting. Where did it come from? How did she get it? She says, quote, "The screen was bought by my uncle, Charles C. Goodrich, in the late 1920s. I never knew much about it except it was very decorative, and he rebuilt his drawing room so that it took up most of one wall without any interruption in the doors. My uncle died in 1932, and recently his things have been offered for sale with the Near family having first choice, and I immediately thought of your museum as being a suitable and, I hope, interested place to give it." However, she goes on to note, "There is one panel that is torn, but I trust you will not find it otherwise damaged." So it's important to note from this little bit of correspondence some of the things Brackenridge provides. First, the painting came from her uncle, Charles Cross Goodrich, who was the son of B.F. Goodrich, the tire person. And he put this painting in the drawing room in his large house up in York, Maine. I think it was recently put for sale on Craigslist if you're interested. But it gives us a sense that this 6-panel screen, he probably acquired it that way. He didn't have it remounted to put in his room. Rather, he modified his house in order to accommodate it. Also, she notes it was a Japanese screen, but doesn't provide any rationale for why that's the case. Probably it was passed on from Goodrich to her. And you know how this is when you have heirlooms. Your grandparents say, "We got this from so-and-so, this is such and such." So tales get attached to things. But she also notes that the painting was damaged at this time already. This will become a trend with this painting, unfortunately. Nevertheless, the painting was taken in, and you can see it here, 1950, shown proudly in the museum. But if we skip to 1958, another pivotal thing happens in this painting's life. Sherman Lee, the celebrated American art historian, at the time, one of the recognized people writing about Asian art, later director at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Lee came down to Dayton and was looking at the collection, and he saw this painting and said, "Japanese painting, huh?" Well, I'm paraphrasing here. "Japanese painting, huh? Maybe not." Rather, Lee thought it's probably a Chinese painting that was maybe remounted in Japan, and maybe the gold leaf was added. So kind of speculating here, but nevertheless, he says, you probably don't want to call this a Japanese painting. So at this point, the painting was re-identified from Japanese to Chinese. Why would Lee think that it was maybe a Chinese painting? Well, possibly one reason would be on the back of one of the panels is an inscription that suggests the painting came from the Song Dynasty. So hundreds of years earlier. And even probably from a glance, Lee would know this was kind of spurious. It's not Song Dynasty. Nevertheless, it might be a Chinese painting that then was taken to Japan and later transformed. So, nevertheless, the painting did accept this, and subsequent excerpts would visit the museum and say, yes, it's a Chinese painting. It's large, impressive, but it's mostly decorative. It's not that important. So even as late as 1963, the museum goes with Lee's designation and even notes that it was probably remounted in Japan. So the painting was shown a little bit longer, but gradually, as you noticed, it had condition issues. The issues got worse and worse. The painting started to lift away from its mount. Tears started to show more. And then gradually, the painting was just put away in storage and largely forgotten. But that's not the end of the story for this painting. If we jump ahead to 2007, Sherman Lee's identification of this as a Chinese painting, while in the end not correct, was important because that's how it came to the attention of a group of researchers from Tokyo University. They were traveling around the country documenting Chinese paintings in American collections. And there were multiple volumes, but here's one volume. Home may recognize this painting because there's paintings from the Met in here, but there's also Cincinnati Art Museum, and at the very back, a couple pages from the Dayton Art Institute, where you can see Dayton's painting is featured. Because it was called a Chinese painting in 2007, therefore they photographed it and put it in the book. But that's how later on a researcher at Tokyo University, Misato Ito, who's pictured here in the foreground, this came to her attention. She was a student at Tokyo University, and now she's at the Kyoto Institute of Technology. But her research interest is at this intersection of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean painting. And she saw the photos of this and thought, something's going on here. This looks different, but it's not a Japanese painting, but it's probably not a Chinese painting, so what's happening? She wanted to see it in person. So in 2017, she arranged a visit along with Sujin Kim, who is in the background there, who is currently affiliated with, she had been at Seoul National University, at Sungkyun Kwan University. And both of them had worked together at a research institute at Harvard for a while. So they've been pursuing some of these research interests together for a while. They were very excited and examined the painting closely. And after they looked at it, they said, well, you know, it was identified as Japanese. Then Sherman Lee came along and said Chinese. We think it's actually probably Korean. So here we have the third permutation in the identity of this painting. So why would they speculate that this was a Korean painting? Well, one fact was the monumental size of this, when you think of 8 feet by 24 feet. For those of you that are interested in Japanese and Chinese art, try to think of how many screen paintings you know of that are this size. And an important thing that they pointed out also was that in the early 1900s in Korea, especially during the time of the Korean Empire from about 1897 to 1910, there were radical westernization changes happening. They were even changing the architecture in the palace to have higher ceilings. So you were actually having larger paintings being made that could accommodate these spaces. So you start to get an idea of where this might even be dated. Also, the fact that this was 12 screens. So here there might have been a little confusion. At the very beginning, when you saw this painting on display in Korea, it was a 12-panel folding screen. But when Dayton got it, it was 6 panels. The paintings had actually been joined together into groupings. So most likely it was originally 12-panel folding screen. And again, most Japanese screens maybe are 6 folding panels in a set of 2 or less, different amounts, but not 12 panels. This is quite unusual and more typical of Korean painting. Also, the iconography of the painting. Even though you may have cranes are a very popular subject in all Asian painting, this particular combination of these symbols of longevity and prosperity, in particular the grouping of peaches, cranes, and the sea, became a very, very popular subject in Korean court painting in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then the use of gold leaf. Again, we think back to the beginning, this was one of those tricky things that maybe made it identified as a Japanese painting. So the gold leaf is important, they noted, but later we'll see why it made it more likely Korean. And finally, there were even some other small details, such as the way that certain dots were added to the painting, or certain ways the flowers were depicted that were very unusual and kind of typical within this period of Korean painting in the early 1900s within the court. So to focus a little bit more on this question of the gold leaf. Again, you tend to associate gold leaf with Japanese screen paintings, but the size of the gold leaf squares are very regular, about 11 centimeters by 11 centimeters. But the squares on this painting were only about 2.5 by 2.5, so about 1 inch by 1 inch. So much smaller, almost a quarter of the size. Furthermore, they were cut very irregularly, and they were applied kind of roughly, as if to say this was a person that wasn't an expert in applying gold leaf. Whereas in Japanese paintings, you have people who are specialists in doing this and know exactly what they're doing. And finally, typical of Japanese paintings is the gold leaf is applied and then the painting. Whereas this, it was reversed. There was the painting, and then you see where the gold leaf was sometimes overlapping the painting. So something different is going on here. Then in 2018, I presented some of this new research at a colloquium at the National Museum of Korea. And that is how we were able to bring it further to the knowledge of experts working in Korean art. And it created a lot of excitement, as I noted that there's only one other known Korean painting with gold leaf in the background, and this is a painting at the Honolulu Museum of Art. And you can see already there's certain similarities with Dayton's painting. Overall, the sizes are roughly similar. Dayton's is a little bit wider, Honolulu's a little bit taller. You can see Honolulu is mounted as a 12-panel folding screen, and it's always been like that. It was restored, and again, as you look at the two paintings and note some of the similarities, you see similar iconography, this theme of the cranes, peaches, the sea, sun, rocks, pine tree. And even somewhat of the composition. In the center, you have this very strong vertical line with a rock, with a crane at the top, organizing the movement of the other cranes. And the use of the gold leaf. And same with the Honolulu painting, it has very small gold leaf squares, roughly cut, roughly applied, even with a lacquer coating over the top of them. And one of the important things then about being able to compare these two paintings is that the Honolulu painting on one side has an inscription, which most likely dates it to 1902 and to a royal commission. So here we have it, a strongly identified Korean screen painting with gold leaf, and then Dayton's painting is strongly similar to it. So after further consultation with experts in Korea, they really did come to a consensus that this is a Korean painting, most likely from the early 20th century and associated with the royal court. But beyond that, no other information has come to light. However, through presenting the results, we were able to connect with the Overseas Korean Cultural Heritage Foundation. And one of the things that they do is support conservation for artworks outside of Korea, things that desperately need support. So in 2018, we had a site visit from them where they were able to examine the painting, look closer at it, think about what would be involved with it, because as you can imagine, conservation on something 8 by 24 is very in-depth and it's not cheap. But we were honored to receive a grant from them to help support the cost of the conservation. So from 2019, then the painting started its physical transformation. It had been re-identified as the Korean painting that it is, and now it was time to give it some pampering and special treatment. So it was crated up in Dayton and then taken to the conservation studio outside of Seoul. Another benefit of connecting with the foundation was they were able to network us with the Gocheon Conservation Institute of Cultural Properties, a lab that specializes in Korean conservation, and the lab that had treated the Honolulu painting. So they were familiar with treating gold leaf in Korean paintings of the early 20th century. So really kind of a match made in heaven. And here it is in 2019 at the Conservation Studio. So even though I'm a curator, I really love conservation. It's something I'm not an expert in, but when you hear conservators talk, it's fascinating. We don't have a lab at the Dayton Art Institute, but we've been able to partner with Cincinnati on some occasions, and as Home can tell you, the conservators there are fantastic, and you just have to listen to them pull out their tools and materials, and you start to be amazed at what they can do. It's almost as exciting as when the artwork was made for the first time. The way that you can bring something back to life and make it something that future generations can enjoy. So we met with other experts for further consultation for the conservation process. And one of the important things to discuss was, if you remember back to Dayton's painting on those 6 panels, the end pieces were shorter, which most likely indicates it was cut down at some point. So why that would be is unknown. It's possible, as you'll see later, the painting had extensive damage, so maybe there was just too much damage that they just cut that off. At the same time, if you are more into a nefarious conspiracy theory, the Honolulu painting had an inscription on one side. And so would it be possible that whoever got a hold of this in the 1920s decided, we'll get rid of that, we'll remount it, we'll label it a Chinese painting and sell it to some unsuspecting American who lives up in York, Maine that just wants to decorate a smoking room with it? Possibly, I don't know. But the debate then became, how do you remount this? If it was most likely a 12-panel screen, we should go that direction. But at the same time, you need it to be even. So do you leave something neutral on the side to tell the viewer, you know, this was probably cut down, use your imagination to fill in the details? Or do you just allow the silk fabric border to cover it over so you have a less distracting image? In the end, it was decided to go with the first alternative, to be a little bit more upfront and art historically accurate for the viewer. So quickly, I'll just give you a little bit of the insight into the conservation process, because how many of you at home have ever had something break or damage? Maybe it's a favorite mug, maybe it's a piece of furniture, and you needed to try and fix it. And then maybe it's easy, maybe it's not. All of a sudden you have super glue all over your fingers and you're giving up. So on the top here, you can see these were all areas where there were losses in the silk painting, probably going all the way back to before 1920 when it was remounted in Japan. And so again, this is very possible it was just wear and tear from if this was a court painting used for special events. Things get used, moved around, and you may have damage. But then when it was remounted, all of those areas were filled in with new silk that wasn't matching very well, and then overpainted. Because if you want to sell this to a foreign market, everybody wants to have a complete image. You don't want to just have gaps and missing things and damage. And likewise, on the bottom, you can see where there were cracks and breaks significantly across the surface of the silk. So the first step was just consolidating the surface of the existing painting, making sure that as they work on it, it's not going to have any additional damage take place. And that was done just by applying animal glue that was significantly diluted to stabilize the surface. Then the paintings were removed from the existing mount. And things like this I always find fascinating. As you're conserving, you're needing to continue to protect the painting as you're working on it. So then you would have facing papers like this, just small thin strips of paper that especially protect the fragile portions on the surface of the painting. And then here's where you have those areas of the infilling that happened in the 1920s and the new painting that had to all be removed so that you could return the painting to its original condition. And whenever you get into a conservation project, you're wondering, what are you going to discover when you tear everything apart? And there weren't any super exciting discoveries. You're always hoping for that inscription or that documentary evidence that leaves the smoking gun. But nevertheless, there were strips of paper that had writing in Japanese on them, most likely confirming again this was remounted in Japan. And if you remember, this was 12 paintings mounted onto 6 panels. So then these were the backing strips that helped join 2 of those paintings together before they were applied to a single panel. So then once all of that old backing paper, old infills, all that was removed, then it was time to get to work stabilizing the painting and remounting it. So lining things up, you think all those cracks in the silk, that had to all be modified, lined up accurately, and then adding the various layers of backing papers, and then even dyeing silk, because then they needed to come up with new silk, but silk that was woven in such a way that it matched the existing silk, and even dyeing it with alder cones in order to give it that antiquated finish. And then for each one of those losses, tracing the loss, and then cutting that into new pieces of silk that were then applied, stabilizing the gold leaf, And then the decision was to focus on conservation rather than preservation, that restore the painting to a place where it could safely be presented, but don't do a lot of extensive in-painting that's going to later be distracting or need to be redone. So all those losses were then just done in a neutral color that allowed it to hopefully disappear, but not trying to make everything unified. And then finally, you think the painting's ready to go, where is it going to go to? So when you have a European painting, it's nice you can just stick it in a frame and hang it on the wall. But for a painting like this, it has to have a much more extensive support system. So a completely new frame was made for the 12-panel folding screen. Then on either side, multiple layers of mulberry paper were added up. So it's light, but it's actually very strong and very stable. The paintings were reapplied, and then the silk fabrics were added around the outside. And so then, if you remember, this was Dayton's painting, and this was the resulting painting after it had been remounted and conserved. So you may be wondering, when do I get a chance to see this? As Helen said, unfortunately, we weren't able to get it out of storage and find a place we could safely display it and have you all come see it. But this coming summer, we're going to have a special exhibition on the art of conservation, and this will be one of the centerpiece artworks, so you'll really be able to take it all in then. So of course, we'll be sharing news with you all so that you'll be able to come see it then, and maybe we could debrief again. So I hope this is just one artwork, but as you see it, you get an interesting story of art history, but I think you can also get a sense that paintings can tell us something a little bit about our own lives, that no matter where you go, no matter how far you may end up from home, and all the rough treatment you may experience, nevertheless, you may be able to make it home eventually and start over again. So at this moment, I just want to pause and take questions about this. And then if we have time, I can follow up with a little more information about our collection as a whole. Yes?
I have just a comment. Your comment about Sherman Lee dismayed and upset me, since he was one of my heroes. I think that he could have made a mistake. Oh my goodness. Was it because it was an offhanded comment that he made? I'm trying to find excuses for him, since he is perfect. So is there something, there's a similarity that he was looking at that made him think that?
That's a great question, because I think even on Cleveland Museum website, there was a blog post, did Sherman Lee ever make mistakes? So it seems he has a reputation. Well, Homemade may, or others may even have something they want to add to this. My opinion just was that he probably recognized something was off and that it wasn't a Japanese painting, but then it had this spurious inscription on the back, and without being able to say any more. And at the same time, if you think about, I don't know everything about Sherman Lee, but it seemed like, he was, yes, an Asian art expert, but also not fluent in the languages. And at the same time, he was probably most familiar with Chinese and Japanese painting, which were the dominant traditions. So if you haven't been schooled in Korean painting, and that speaks also to something more of the significance of this painting, that you may say, well, it's only from around 1900. That's only 100 years old. Is it that significant? But then if you look at the period of Korean art history, and this period of the Korean Empire, and then the subsequent Japanese occupation, and how much Korean art then was taken out of the country, things were, unmounted. So one problem with this project for the conservator was a painting of this size. You have the Honolulu example, but really, they're working a little blind into how this really should be remounted. So they took their best guess, but without the documentation, they had to, go from that. So I think it was, I wanted to share Sherman Lee's comment because it's pivotal, because he did change the designation, but not to disparage him either, because I think he was working with what was in front of him, made an educated guess, and in the end, it was one more piece of the puzzle that then allowed later researchers to see it and then make a new evaluation. So it's really a good lesson that you take your best guess and be willing to be wrong. So
Thank you, I feel better.
you can go home to your Sherman Lee icon and say it's okay. Oh, man.
Yes, I think you will feel better because this is based on the Chinese traditional crane combined dominantly pine tree. These two present the meaning of the message of longevity. So it's a very, very shared subject. And even the blue and green landscape shows a lot of Chinese Qing Dynasty influence. So all that is really very Chinese. I agree with that. In that, I mean, the first impression when you look at something, if you don't know anything, you may think the subject is very Chinese. And even the pose of the crane, like calling toward heaven. There are 6 designated attitudes of cranes. In the earliest Chinese painting, they call the 6 crane design. So of course this is much later, so it's not really faithful to the original design. But actually, that leads me to a question. In Korea, I know in China most of the screens were very few survived. The formal screens used to decorate the palace, but they do have that. And I wonder if they have 12-panel screen and pair. Is it possible?
In Korea?
In Korea or in China, the old ones? Because I know we don't have many survive large screens.
So you're saying as a 12-panel screen as a pair? Oh, I don't know.
Because the reason this lead me to this thought is there is, in Princeton there is a museum, there is a pair of crane painting with the sun on the right, upper right corner like that, and then with the moon on the other paired scroll. So it's a Qing Dynasty design. So I'm just curious could it be possible that there's even another, if the palace is really big, it could happen, but that's just, just a thought.
Oh, it's fun to wonder about that, and you're right though, to my understanding, the same in Korea, you just have so many of these didn't survive that, apart from some sort of documentary evidence. But there is, and this goes to the re-identification of this painting, there is at least written documentation of other gilded screen paintings being made for the Korean court at this time. So there's knowledge those were made, but to this point only 2 are known to have survived.
And is the gilding, influenced by the Japanese technique? The square gold leaf pasted?
Well, my understanding is that it did seem to be inspired because there had been this long exchange of gifts from Japan to Korea of screen paintings for hundreds of years, and that there had been, certain attempts to kind of imitate, not with gold leaf, but to imitate this certain style. But then it was around this time, early 1900s, you saw these examples of people actually trying to gild leaves. But it also speaks to, at the time, early 1900s, that at the Korean court you had Korean but also Japanese painters working. So it's an open question whether the artist of this, what the nationality of the artist was. So.
You said this was one of only 2 surviving sort of palace screens, the one being in Honolulu and this one. So I'm kind of curious with the Korean government, especially the Korean, art world, having these 2 large pieces of heritage left. And certainly I understand that they want to do everything that they can to help these things survive and to repair them and so forth. But was there any kind of a thought or any kind of movement on their part to try to reclaim these things for Korea?
That's a great question. And first, it's one of only 2 known surviving court screens with the gold leaf. So there may be some other examples of large court screen paintings, but with the gold leaf, that was
Well,
those
that
2.
would make it even more
Yeah.
important then.
Yeah. And in our conversations with them, it never came up. But for example, the Overseas Korean Cultural Heritage Foundation is very actively working also to acquire Korean artworks to bring them back to Korea. So there's a lot of repatriation that way. I think they probably understand that the art museums are such that, people abide by the UNESCO agreement and certain things that everybody agrees that if it was looted or stolen, it'll be repatriated. But when you get into situations like this where it's perhaps longer ago, and unless there was a real strong case that showed that this was really taken out through illicit means, so they never approached us, and the conversation never came up, but it's interesting.
Well, because you talk about the time period, and you're certainly, 1905, 1910, you have Japan who's basically telling Korea, you are no longer Korea, you are now a satellite of Japan. You are going to speak Japanese, you're going to, you are essentially, you are under Japanese control. So in my mind, I'm thinking, especially with the fact that you talk about that there might be pieces of the panel on each side that have been removed. My thought is, if I were Japanese and I were taking what I thought were the best pieces of Japanese art, and I'm taking them back to Japan for whatever reason, I don't necessarily want Korean writing on the sides of the panel because I don't want it to be identified as Korean, because Korea no longer exists. Korea is now part of Japan. So I guess in my mind, I'm thinking, could this not have been taken purposefully by Japanese officials the same way that you have all of these, monument men, that whole exhibit that's been in the museum, basically all of these art treasures that were taken, by the Germans with the idea that, hey, you're all going to be under German control. This all then technically belongs to us now, so we're just going to take it. So same kind of thing. Korea no longer exists. Japan is in charge. We're just going to take all of this. Hence it ends up in Japan. Hence any reference to Korea has been removed. And the fact that nobody identifies it as Korean is the fact that at that point in time, even in the 20s, for all means and purposes, Korea no longer exists.
You raised several good points, which I think could go into several discussions. And obviously, within museums, these conversations are always evolving as to what does it mean for something to have been taken under duress or to need to be repatriated. So I think those should always be ongoing. But it's interesting, you mentioned that like in relation to this painting or the Honolulu one, that with the Japanese occupation, I'm by no means an expert on that period, but for example, the owner of the Honolulu painting, a man named Tomita Gisaku, was an industrialist working in Korea, Japanese, but he formed a large collection of Korean art. And so from that perspective, doing a good thing to preserve the Korean cultural heritage, and even had a museum in Korea where he showed these things. So was it, you could criticize him for how he acquired the art, but at the same time there was a consciousness of wanting to commemorate the Korean heritage. And then this relates to an open question about the Dayton painting. We know that this Goodrich acquired it, but we don't know when or where, just sometime in the 20s. And that's a missing piece of the puzzle. But the Honolulu painting, Gisaku then around 1926 had to liquidate his entire collection of Korean art and sold it through Yamanaka and Company, a major Japanese dealer, especially through their New York store. And then that's where Honolulu's founder purchased the painting, was from Yamanaka in New York. And Goodrich had a home in New Jersey, and so if you want to speculate, it was right around the same time, late 1920s. Could this have been brought over at the same time, part of this large collection? It's all speculation at this point. But I think it's a bit of a messy picture when you you look at the broader geopolitics, but even within that, it wasn't always an attempt to efface things, because the Honolulu screen, to my knowledge, has always been recognized as a Korean screen painting. And Dayton's, it's possible that maybe it wasn't anything nefarious about cutting it down. It was really damaged. You just needed to make it presentable for sale. There could be other reasons. So I didn't want to suggest that there was completely an agenda going on there. So it doesn't answer your question, but hopefully.
But there could be, because I think what people sometimes don't realize, especially as Westerners, is that whole sort of geopolitical thing that was very real at the time. It still very much exists. I think there's a tendency to kind of not necessarily take into account some of those things and how they can affect even pieces of art.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, exactly.
I'm half Korean. My grandfather, at age 7, went to Japan and basically lived in Japan and went to school there until he came back to marry my grandmother. He considered himself, in many ways, more Japanese than Korean. So I guess from that personal perspective that I have, I just think as Westerners, you don't realize those undertones that are present at that period in time, all the way up until the Korean War. And I think it's very important, because I think it colors more than people think it does.
No, great points. And I think also you pointed, and again, why a painting like this would still be very valuable when it seems so new, because it comes from especially a period when you have a lot of things that don't remain.
Well, it's the end of the Korean dynasty. I mean, the Joseon dynasty, that was essentially Korea's, their last king, their last emperor. So all of those thousands of years of history disappear.
You mentioned earlier that the Korean banknotes have the images.
Yes.
Now, the question is it a direct copy from that? And when did that take place? And did the museum have to give permission? Or do you know much about that?
Yeah. Sorry that the slide's all the way at the very beginning.
Well, I thought it was interesting because I'm a goldsmith and I saw those gold medals.
Let's see how quickly we can get back there.
It was very, very early, yeah.
Yeah.
So as to when that happened,
There it was.
that coincided with this project. The Comsco, the Korean Mint, partners with the foundation. So they will do these commemorative medals that are then sold within Korea to collectors. It's a very popular thing. They aren't particularly cheap. So then in that way, Comsco is able to raise funds that they can give to the foundation to support future conservation. So for example, Dayton's project was partly funded by a previous commemorative medal they made for another artwork. So this was something that kind of coincided with the conservation process. They learned about the painting and then requested permission from us in order to make these commemorative medals. And the bills, they're just commemorative gold and silver bills, but they weren't made for circulation. Mm-hmm.
So the gold leaf that was pasted, you said they were quite small, 1 inch by 1 inch,
Mm-hmm.
but the discolorations around the square discolorations that seem to indicate that the gold leaf was much larger than it actually is. So did they make it intentionally in here?
Oh, you mean,
Yeah.
that's actually, that's the frame underneath. You can see, so like the old mounting showing through, yeah. I thought the same thing when I first saw it. I thought these are gigantic. So, yeah.
Holly? Okay, so I wouldn't have thought that this was made in the early 20th century. It's in a very antiquated style. And I'm making a mental comparison to contemporary Japanese Nihonga paintings. And there's so many different stylistic varieties. And there were artists in Japan who were intentionally making this kind of really traditional styles of painting. So I'm wondering about the cultural context of Koreans painting in the early 20th century. Do we know anything about the artists who produced this painting? Or like what kind of artistic milieu existed there? Like were there different styles of painting coexisting in Korea at the time?
I probably couldn't provide you too much more beyond the evidence we have of this, the Honolulu, and I don't have the slide for it, but then in the 1920s, there were also some new murals made for some of the Korean palaces, but in this same kind of older style.
Right.
So
That makes sense.
drawing on these themes of
Yeah.
prosperity. So then completely separate from, what was going on in kind of the contemporary art scene, which I couldn't comment on.
Right. But we don't know anything about the artist who made this, do we?
Not this one, no.
Right, yeah.
No. So that's where the murals made in the 20s, those have identified artists.
Oh.
And there also is knowledge of active Korean artists and Japanese artists working for the court as opposed to anonymous court painters like earlier in the Joseon dynasty. But for this painting, and even Honolulu's painting, doesn't have an attributed artist yet. Yeah.
You mentioned, talked about, my question is about restoration. You had mentioned that you had to replace some silk that had to have the exact threads and the exact weave and so forth. What is your source for your restoration materials? How do you get something like that to match?
That would be a question for the conservator that specializes in this. And
Well,
so,
I mean, can you make these things, or is there a place that has
Oh,
the
yeah.
proper glues and so forth?
yeah, I mean, it's, I guess you'd have to say cottage industry, and something that they're always working to preserve, to have expert artisans that are able to make the mulberry paper. Or, for example, on the back of the Dayton screen, they put a paper that actually has moss in it, which is a very unusual kind of Korean paper. And
I mean, there's sources that actually work for the restoration.
or people that do make these traditional products that are used. And likewise for the silk, working with traditional weavers that would be able to make a silk that has the same kind of weaving pattern that then the conservator could work with. They can dye it, they can also pound it, because of course 100-year-old silk is going to be very different than new silk. So they can manipulate it in different ways. That's why conservation is so fascinating.
But these
They
are
have these
outside
different tools.
firms that do all this.
But some conservators do it, Polly, because I know, I can't remember if it was Obi or our conservators at the Art Museum have done docent talks. And I don't remember what they were doing, but one time they had this incredible chart of the dyes that they were creating at the camp to match something that they were doing. I'm sorry, I don't remember what it was. But it was the most beautiful chart, because it just slowly, the color changed until they got one that was going to match what they were doing. But I know our own conservators have some ability to do things in-house like that they have the training. This was a wild chemical formula that she just would change just a tiny little bit until it got to what she needed.
It just seems so extensive, but tedious.
Yeah, tedious, yeah.
Patience.
Very
Yeah.
much so.
It really is phenomenal that, and often it's a mix of high-tech and also low-tech, very ancient traditions that are passed on, and you need to kind of be able to balance those. But even, for example, here, the conservator is the one that's hand dyeing the silk to give it an antiquated finish, or likewise, they were hand dyeing the indigo fabric silk that was going to go around the outside. So it's certainly
But the weave, even the weave.
Yeah. So it's
Pretty sophisticated.
the energy that goes into preserving art for the future.
Yeah. Oh, just a little thing, there's in Kanazawa in Japan, that is specialized, all that gold leaf, if you ever see any gold leaf, those are the craftspeople now that do it, conservation. There's a cool museum there, you can learn about it.
I'm wondering how old is that Hawaiian piece? Because the gold color looks much newer.
Yes.
Mm.
Maybe they preserved it better, or
The Hawaiian one is most likely 1902. Yeah, it has, whether it's partly the photography, but it has a much brighter finish, doesn't it? Even compared, well, this is pre-conservation, but certainly Dayton's doesn't quite have the brightness to it. So roughly probably the same time, but the Honolulu one's certainly older. So do you think it looks a little too nice?
They kept it very well, you know.
Yeah. And also the power of photography. When you go house shopping, you see things online, then you actually see the house and you think, is this the same place? So, but, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm an artist, I always think about the creators, technicians, and you keep alluding to like these paintings were done for the court. So where in Korea are we talking? In the early 1900s, like what city, what region?
Oh, around Seoul, yeah.
Okay, so that would have been the only place this would have happened in the whole country.
I mean, that kind of court art.
Yeah, it is
it's
court
done
art.
in
And-
Korea, but other paintings were done in other parts of Korea, south and, you know, all over.
And they had a big folk painting tradition too.
How many artists or how long would it take to make something like that? I mean, does it involve a lot of artists and a lot of years, or what goes into this?
Do you ever watch Bob Ross?
It's all done in half an hour, isn't it?
But nevertheless, go ahead, Home.
Yeah, I am curious, just like related to the other question is, what is the context? Is there a specific function, like where is it placed in the palace, or did anybody did research on this type of formal screen, large screen, how they were placed in the palace?
There are some photos of these on display, and obviously for different special occasions. I mean, some of them were also used outside. So, but even with something like Honolulu having an inscription for when it was made, was it only shown for that one time? When a special commemoration for an anniversary for the emperor by the crown prince, was it only once, or after that, yeah, could it have been brought out for other special occasions? So there is some photographic documentation, but with the Dayton painting, it's anybody's guess at this
It
point.
would be perfect for a birthday because longevity.
Absolutely. And if other people have comments to add, feel free. So. Yes.
Talking about that, is that something where and I don't know if any of these records exist, because I know a lot of them, you know, were family records, all sorts of things were destroyed. But are there court records that exist? Has anybody ever kind of gone into just the daily records of the court? Because at least in certain periods, I mean, everything was recorded. So, I mean, is that something that anybody has specifically researched?
Well, you're right. Like if you will go to like the National Palace Museum, yeah, you'll see these things displayed of just the special ceremonies. Things were highly documented, carefully recorded. So when it comes to this, I defer to some of those other experts. For example, like Sujin Kim, who has done a lot of work on these and looked at a lot of that. You know, information is out there, but you also kind of think they've looked at some of those and things haven't turned up yet. So it's not to say that it won't, but that was a question I had also. You thought if this is made for the court, you would kind of think somebody would be keeping a ledger somewhere. We had A, B, and C paintings made this day. But again, with the passage of time and with political events and the loss of documentation.
And war.
And war, yeah, you continue to hope that things somehow survive, but short answer, to my knowledge, things haven't turned up yet. Any other questions? These are all fantastic questions. I was preparing for this with my wife, and we were always anticipating what are the kinds of things people are going to ask, and we can always only prepare so much.
So you said that the painting was actually done before the gold leaf was put on. So is the painting directly on the screen or the silk
On silk, yes.
with no binding?
Well, the paint would have had some sort of a binder in it, like an animal glue, yeah. But then otherwise, I don't know if there was really any preparation to it, otherwise painted on the silk. Yeah. Well, we've reached more than our time limit, so I didn't get
warned
to.
you. I warned you about the question.
So I will just tell you to come see our Korean collection. We recently did reinstall it. Yes, Nagas.
What else is coming on?
Art exhibitions?
I mean, what else is being shown in the Korean gallery?
Oh, in the Korean gallery? Well, I'll skip through it very quickly. We have about 70 Korean objects in the collection, but the majority of it is ceramics, but a nice representation from across many of the different periods. So we have, early Three Kingdoms Shila works, ones that have, wonderful stamped decoration, and then show some nice examples of white porcelain with underglazed blue decoration. And then a nice collection of Celadon ware, especially with the black and white inlay. And we did recently reinstall the gallery with support from the National Museum of Korea. And the main improvement was expanding into this Chinese gallery. 1, 13, 12, and 11, 10 are all Chinese, so it really had plenty of space. So what we wanted to do was give the Korean art a larger footprint. And so you can see here we used to have this built-in case, but then we took that out and really kind of opened up the area, and it's allowed us to show, almost double the artwork that was on view before. And then also just some logistics. It was kind of a really wonky corner that you would come around and wouldn't even look back there, so we just installed some built-in cases. So really just being able to freshen up the space and display more. And even practical things like before we had this case with this light filter, the painting we just had conserved can't fit in there as is. So we had to remove that, raise the ceiling a bit so we could anticipate for the future. And then expanding into that extra gallery, adding new casework. Yeah. So please come and see it. And we have, right now one of our Asian exhibitions is contemporary Japanese calligraphy artist, a Japanese-American artist that's on view. So please come see it. And look forward to talking with you more. So thank you very much again for the invitation.